Teresa Benjamin. I'm the Research Communications Officer, so it's my responsibility and pleasure to introduce these research talks where we get to expand our community and look at other disciplines that maybe we haven't really touched on yet. So today, Professor Craig Hardiman is here with us. He's an Associate Professor of Classical Studies. His work primarily focuses on the domestic art of the Hellenistic period, which, if you don't know, because I definitely didn't know, is from 323 to 31 BCE. The kinds of sculptures, paintings, and mosaics people would have had in their homes is the type of stuff he's curious about. He's interested in how people understood their art, and so he has an interest in ancient aesthetic theory and the possible ways that modern neuroscience can help in this understanding. So today, we're going to hear all about how classical studies intersects with game studies, and to my knowledge, at least in my time here, this hasn't been something that we've formally discussed in this style. So questions that are going to come up, I hope, we'll see. Things like what can we learn from the ways that games utilize Hellenistic art to develop their worlds? What does this say about the games industry? And perhaps most importantly, what does Veni, Vidi, Vici, Domino, Pugnam mean?
I can answer two of those three questions.
Excellent, because I typed that out in all of the promotions for this talk, and every time I felt like an imposter because I was waiting until today to find out.
Okay.
So please welcome Craig.
Thank you. Well, we can get that out of the way first with a bit of a throwback to her classes. Jen, would you like to translate that Latin for us?
I came, I saw, I conquered. Something about fighting.
Yeah. This is Julius Caesar's famous line that after he had sort of conquered everyone, defeated his enemies and everything else, he said, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. So I thought I would just throw that in. And so the Domino Pugnam is a kind of bad modern Latin version of boss battle. So there you go. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. It's my first, hopefully not last, but we'll see how you like this talk, interaction with the Games Institute. I've only really just started to sort of merge two of my passions, video games and the study of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Hopefully this will all be of interest to you here. I'm interested not only in the video games themselves, but gamification, immersive technologies, how these can be used pedagogically. So I think it all fits well with the kinds of things that the Institute here does. Now, I will say this is an area I'm only kind of beginning to explore professionally. I don't claim any expertise in this. I really hope you're not going to ask me any in-depth questions on game studies or game theory or anything like that. But I hope it'll be fun. I hope it'll be fruitful. And if nothing else, I hope it starts a conversation between the oldest of all the academic disciplines, classical studies, and one of the newer ones in game studies. Now, my interest in video games began at a fairly young age. I grew up, for a variety of reasons, fairly bored with the universe, finding very little interest in the people and places around me. Jen can let you know that very little has changed in all these years. So it was really kind of no wonder that I got into created worlds, worlds that seemed really kind of far away in time and place, and that for a child presented things in relatively simple terms, and especially for someone like myself who's very visual, in very visual terms. This started prophetically enough with Asterix comics, the worlds of the Gauls, the Romes, magic potions, cute dogs, and all that jazz. It progressed into interests in mythology, stories of gods, monsters, heroes. And next, of course, well, from there, why not create my own worlds, and got into Dungeons and Dragons and all that stuff, culminating in reading science fiction and fantasy novels like Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, etc. And so with that kind of a background, it was no wonder that when video games sort of became a thing in the mid to late 70s, I was an early adopter of these new and immersive interactive worlds. I believe, I might have this wrong, I believe it was Christmas 1980 when I asked for and got one of the original Atari 2600s with its 8-pixel sprites, 40-pixel playfield graphics, 60 frames per second gameplay, and 128 possible colors. Needless to say, I was blown away and captivated. I played Space Invaders, Pitfall, Adventure until I got carpal tunnel from that horrible joystick. And over the time, I necessarily graduated to other home systems, arcades with its higher graphics and adrenaline-fueled storefronts and all that. And should you ever find yourself in my office at home, you can still see the echoes of these escapes, as my closet still has all my Dungeons & Dragons books, game guides, comic books, no actual professional material to be found. Now, why do I say this? Well, I say this partially to establish my street cred, or geek cred, for the audience. I'm old. Yes, many of you have grown up in a world of omnipresent video games that I never could have imagined. But I've been playing these things for 40 years. And I've been immersing myself in popular worlds based on classical ideas and frameworks for almost 50. It's also, however, to reinforce the idea that video games have been using the ideas and themes of classical culture, history, myths, and narrative techniques for just about as long. Now, I admit I have not done exhaustive researching on this, but as near as I can tell, the first video game to allude to classics was 1982's Atlantis. Now this game, oh, we're moving around, and we're just gonna stop there because that'll annoy me. There we go. It was 1982's Atlantis. Now this game had very little to do with the classical world. You just repel invaders from destroying your city, just like Space Invaders. But the city happens to be Atlantis. There's probably something there about the way in which Atlantis and its myth have been misused over the millennia. But the earliest game that I can find with a specific reference to classics is 1984's Hercules, seen here in his famous medieval fantasy armor. And as you can see in the absolutely delightful gameplay, you basically swing from vines, jump from platform to platform until you get to your end goal, in this case, fighting the Nemean lion. Now, as goofy as this may seem, it illustrates that classics, unsurprisingly with its mythology, history, and cast of characters, has been a component of video games content from the genre's outset. And yet, unlike film, novels, or other forms of communication that have been the subject of numerous scholarly works for decades, the study of video games as a vehicle for classical reception is only in its infancy. While there have been a few articles here and there over the years, it was only with the arrival of Andrew Reinhardt's Archaeogaming in 2018 that scholars began to look at video games more in depth. Now, Reinhardt, I have here a doctoral student, but I think I actually saw a tweet last week that said he got his PhD. But anyway. He's at the University of York, and he has since become synonymous with the fields of material culture in gaming, though he's much more interested in issues of archaeology, sort of history of and perceptions of archaeology as a discipline. So he writes a lot, and in this book there's a lot of things on, Lara Croft, and the problem of associating her with archaeology, what is archaeology in Tomb Raider games, that kind of a thing. But beyond this volume, and I would certainly suggest if people have interest in this kind of thing, go to his page, archaeogaming.com. He's got some great blogs and podcasts and all kinds of things on archaeology and gaming that are on there. But really, it is only just now, my copy from Amazon is shipping as we speak. It just came out, that we have this more typical disciplinary volume on classics and video games. The collection of essays in this volume, Classical Antiquity and Video Games, will deal more with the images, impacts, and receptions of the classical world as major themes in video games, and will hopefully fill an important gap in the realm of classical reception studies, as well as look to form an interdisciplinary bridge between classical reception and historical game studies. Now, beyond these reception studies, the impact that gaming can have on the discipline of classics is only just being considered. It was just in 2017, in a blog post, that David Frederick, an associate professor of classics at the University of Arkansas, asked the question, well, what can classicists do with video games? Though he was more concerned with issues of pedagogy, describing how as far back as 2004, he had students in one of his seminars use free online software to design a Roman house, he does lay out the ways in which one can design a game for educational purposes. From this, he and his team developed a game called Cyculum. This game is designed to be used as a course, an intro to Roman civilization, not in concert with a classroom course, but as a course itself. You immerse yourself in the lives of individual Romans, you play through the events from the time of Hannibal all the way to late antiquity. Elements of the gameplay were designed as educational, such as the combat system meant to teach about Roman warfare and violence, a debate system meant to teach about oratory and politics, and a client management system meant to explore the patron-client relationship among ancient Romans. Have a look. I thought this would be especially interesting for the people here.
There you are, Fulvia. Come over here and speak with your old grandmother. There are matters we must discuss. As you can see, our family has many who contributed to its growth, its glory, its survival. Before you settle on this path you have chosen, I feel you must first know what you will be throwing away.
Assembly of the people. Rome finds itself amidst a crisis.
Think about it. We are some of the most respected people in Rome now.
Am I the gossip of all Rome living?
What does the graffiti tell you?
I have a reputation, remember?
You belong to Rome, and Rome belongs to me.
Why are you telling me this?
To educate you.
There's a great deal of frustration in Marcus.
I heard about your promotion. Augustus must really see something in you.
Maybe you should leave the town's patronage to those better suited.
You need clients. That's not exactly for the taking. We have an election. I seem to finally be getting through to you, young Fulvia. I am a Vestal priestess of Rome.
I owe you nothing.
Where's your loyalty?
So you feel nothing?
I didn't mean for this to follow you.
Do you realize what you've done?
Family overall, Titus, that's what matters.
This is what our republic has been reduced to now. Marcus, the passage of one age to the next.
So I think that gives you an idea of the kinds of things that at least are out there. If you're interested in this, I suggest you go to the University of Arkansas Tesseract page. They've got a lot more information on the game. In addition, Cyclum's a few years old. They have since developed a slightly newer one as an introduction to Greek mythology class as well. So it's the kind of things you might be interested in. But it shows you then, whether it's those early Atari games or Cyclum, that these games and their uses as either entertainment or pedagogy are in-depth and interactive worlds with a strong narrative engagement. So their analysis as vehicles for classical reception is obvious, as is the reasons why you would do so. The video game industry is, of course, the single largest entertainment industry across the globe. And so, while some people still want to view it as a kind of niche entertainment sector, video games really provide an important corpus of material for the study of classical reception, not least of which because these days many people have their first introduction to the ancient world through the games that they play. Now, these are obviously not the most accurate data, but you can see from various industry lists and compilations that there are hundreds of video games that have some foundation in classical antiquity, be they large-scale productions from huge game development companies or small independent games, RPGs, RTSs, platformers, puzzlers, whatever you want. To date, I have found 86 games set in ancient Greece, 56 games set in ancient Rome, and 12 set in the Byzantine Empire, so sort of what the Roman Empire transformed into in the medieval period. Now, this says nothing, of course, of the numerous games set in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, etc. Now, these numbers reflect games that are tied very directly into classical antiquity. One can, I think, stretch the influence of classics in gaming narratives as a Western European storytelling foundation, and this has been done many times in various reception studies. And so, with this in mind, if you do find some classical content or classical parallels in any games, I think they can broadly fit into 3 categories. And these are just to think with. I'm not a big believer in categorization schemes, and obviously things don't fit nice and neatly into them. It's just a way to sort of help think about these things. The first kind of game is what I would just say is general influence. I would see this as a kind of inspiration, but not a direct representation of classical antiquity. This could be anything from taking ideas from a Greek drama and presenting them as a futuristic space shooter, or more often using things like monsters or architecture or other generic elements to populate the world. The second kind of game is one that is set directly in or based on classical antiquity. Here you play during the time period or an event that could be real or imagined, but is recognizably classical. This could be as a hoplite soldier during the Peloponnesian War, it could be as a god manipulating events around you, or it could be a sim game where you start as the backwater of Rome and through the manipulation of resources grow into an empire. No matter the conceit behind the game, you are left in no doubt that it represents ancient Greece or ancient Rome. Lastly, we have a game that combines the two. One where the setting or story is very classical, but there's a heavy amount of fantastical things involved. You could be a Roman soldier who gets captured by aliens, for example. You can think of the first category as having classical elements, the second category as being fundamentally classical, and the third as being classical in trope or even just sort of window dressing. Now, I'll take a brief look at examples from the first and third categories, and then look a little bit more in depth at the second. Now, a good popular example of a game that is inspired by classical antiquity rather than based directly on it would be World of Warcraft. So, Warcraft, WoW, is, as you know, a hugely popular game that is played worldwide by millions of people. Now, the game has several basic elements that can be considered as inspired by classical antiquity. But for now, I want you to sort of keep this idea of the hero journey in the back of your mind. We'll come back to that. So, as you know, WoW is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game set within a fantasy world, but the game has elements of steampunk, sci-fi, and various other things. First game released in 2004, it's had several updates, and currently has roughly, it fluctuates, 10 million players worldwide. In the game, you choose a character and choose a race, such as dwarf or elf, a class, such as mage or warrior, and then go online to play the game in a giant open-world campaign. You then level up your character through actions to become more powerful and get better gear, and if this all sounds rather familiar, it should. It would be an entirely separate talk for me to go into the relationship between classical antiquity and Dungeons & Dragons, but think of this as a mediating step through which modern RPGs often adapt classical material. So even if WoW is ultimately getting its stuff from Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeons & Dragons got its stuff from the classical world. So, what material are we talking about? Well, most obviously, this is seen in the creatures that inhabit the game, the monsters and the characters you will meet. So, to start, you can decide to choose as one of your races a Tauren or a Minotaur, just like an elf or a human or a dwarf, but you end up kind of flipping the myth on its head. So rather than hunting the Minotaur is the one doing the hunting here. You can encounter such monsters as harpies, seen here as slightly more avian than their ancient Greek counterparts. You obviously have fairly generic things like centaurs, a pretty linear representation within the game's overall aesthetic. My personal favorite is the satyr, here represented as a demon with none of the creature's more frivolous mythological characteristics. In addition, you can gain mounts for your character, like this classically or possibly Near Eastern-inspired griffin. And while I have no idea why you would want to, you can get pets for your character, such as this cute little hydra. I often think of having this as a pet instead of like a cat clawing at your sofa. The Hydra is just sort of dissolving everything with its acid. It'd be kind of annoying as a pet. Anyway, so the characters that populate this world have a definite classical feel, but this also extends to elements such as architecture and other kind of background ambiance things. Take, for example, that most generic of buildings, the ancient Greek temple, here the Parthenon, its most atypical and non-generic version. But you can see echoes of this inhabiting the worlds of the world of Warcraft. So just take the columns, the straight lines, the rectangular roof line, and here, I never know this, Jen, what's the name of this place? Fairless, there's the land of the Dark Elves, right? Okay. But you can clearly see how the architecture has been used here with the columns, the rectangular lines, etc. Even through, you see an archway with a secondary story with columns, all that sort of thing. So you can see how in a game like WoW, the first category, games that have been inspired, maybe even indirectly, by classical antiquity. But I think a really interesting way to look at this is through the lens of the hero journey. Made most famous by Joseph Campbell, but noted by scholars for years prior and since, the idea behind the hero journey is that there's a commonality of traits and experiences among heroes from cultures around the world. In numerous classes, we often teach this idea when looking at the heroes of Greek and Roman myth. But what is unique about the experience in WoW is that you end up co-creating the hero journey as you run your character. Now, interviews with players have indicated the importance that this has on the enjoyment and investment that people have in playing the game. And so, yeah, the interviews have just sort of shown that this participation in creating your own kind of classically inspired hero is particularly important. So in many ways, and in many different kinds of areas, these games invoke a classical past through their storytelling and not just their visual elements. So I would now like to turn to the third category, that mixed group, that may be directly related to classical antiquity, but may also be fantastical or fictional or have some kind of premise that takes it outside of the world, the classical world proper, but it's still kind of identifiable as being ancient Greece or Rome. And the example I'm going to use is God of War. So I had the cinematic from God of War 3 playing when you sat down, just in case I couldn't bludgeon you over the head enough with this thing about mythology and video games. Now, among the most successful game franchises of all time, the God of War series began at the same time as World of Warcraft, but unlike that online game, this, of course, was developed solely for the home console market. The first God of War game was released in 2005 as a PlayStation 2 exclusive. It was immediately hailed as a massive success, won several Game of the Year awards, etc. And this, of course, would lead to a series of sequels, prequels, side games, etc., all of which have been largely successful additions to the game's overall mythos. Now, after taking a brief break, the series returned in 2018, but was refreshed and reimagined using Norse mythology instead of Greek. Hugely popular, these games together have sold over 32 million copies and are seen as the standard for good, if somewhat violent, hack-and-slash games. Now, in this game, the character you play is the warrior Kratos. He is seen here in all of his mean, tattooed, badass, muscled glory, and as his name implies, he is the personification of strength, a warrior without peer, one against whom none can stand, and so he is the epitome of the male fantasy. Now, according to interviews with the game's producers, they took the name Kratos from the ancient Greek. Kratos means strength in ancient Greek. But they actually had no idea there was a character, a god in Greek mythology called Kratos. He is the son of Pallas and Styx. He's first mentioned around 700 BC, and he's most fully fleshed out in the ancient Greek play, the Prometheus Bound. Now, in that play, he is like the character of Kratos. He is merciless, he is pitiless. And of course, given this general character for your background, you are Spartan. While I won't go into it, this game presents yet another instance of the Spartans being used in pop culture in a fairly simplified and simplistic way. Just think 300. So in the game, why is Kratos so angry? Well, it turns out that Ares tricked you into killing your wife and your daughter. And then with the help of Athena, you manage to kill Ares and you assume the mantle of God of War. But you don't stop there. You confront all of the other gods, take them on, and with the help of the Titans, assault Mount Olympus. In the end, the Titans betray you, you kill Zeus, and fed up with the whole lot, you leave the world without any gods, so it is a nice and uplifting storyline. Now, you saw how this started out, as I said, in the cinematic that I had up here. And the whole cinematic, actually, the game begins, God of War 3 begins with a quote from Plato. I actually went into this, and I think the producers just sort of screwed up and had a slight misreading of the Platonic text, and it should be attributed to another scholar, another ancient individual. But the quote, anyway, is the measure of a man is what he does with power. And it leaves you really in no doubt, then, what Kratos is all about. So in the game, we have this murdering psychopath who kills evil and capricious gods with the help of evil and capricious titans. So this begs the question, who exactly is the good guy in this story? The gods are all certainly presented as monsters, individuals of immense power that don't care for humans and use mortals as chess pieces for their amusement. Kratos is hardly a sympathetic figure. Sure, he was tricked into killing his family, but he's presented as a murdering psychopath whose only motivation in life is revenge. So the whole story is very much a kind of Greek tragedy in the modern pop sense. But I would argue it's also in the ancient Greek sense. The story within each of the primary games, so the 3 God of War stories, is really presented as an Aristotelian 3-act story. Aristotle, in his work, The Poetics, goes into detail why you need 3 acts for a good story and what should be in each of those acts. In an article from 2013, Robert Kasser analyzed the game's structure and noted correctly, I think, the basic dependence on a Greek model of storytelling, even if that may have been mediated via Christopher Vogler. And here's where we kind of get back to the hero journey. Christopher Vogler was an executive at Disney working on The Lion King. And he was part of the group about the sort of second Renaissance or second golden age of all those Disney films in the late 80s and early 90s. And he wrote a book called The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structures for Writers, essentially a writer's guide to Joseph Campbell and his hero journey material. The work has essentially become a Hollywood writer's Bible. It's been taught in film school, and writers from all media have this on their bookshelf. And Vogler uses a basic Greek storytelling framework in his manual, stressing the importance of a 3-act structure. Now, another idea from Aristotle that these games present is this idea of pathos, right? Or pity or sadness. I'm curious if you think whether a first-person perspective or a third-person perspective in any of these games changes what kind of pathos or pity these characters might feel. In a third-person view, does that create a distancing effect that allows you to feel more pity for Kratos than if it were from a first-person perspective and you were the ones physically doing the killing and the acts? This is important because the 3-act structure and issues of pathos really put us fully within this notion of an ancient Greek and classical storytelling framework. The game invites us to ask if a murdering psychopath can engender pathos at all. I like to think of this in terms of a number of ancient Greek plays that use this and have to deal with issues of murder and morality, the Oresteia of Aeschylus, Sophocles' Ajax. Probably the most pertinent is a play by the ancient Greek writer Euripides called Hercules Furens, or essentially the Mad Hercules, where Hercules kills his children, is driven mad, ultimately is killed, that sort of thing. Okay, well, if we move on from one classical idea to another, can Kratos experience some kind of catharsis through his violence? Aristotle, in his book The Poetics, clearly links pity, fear, catharsis, and all of this stuff. And a play like Sophocles' Oedipus asks us, how much sympathy do we actually have for a man who was wronged, yet committed a wrong himself? Well, maybe Kratos receives some kind of catharsis. I'm pretty sure he doesn't receive any redemption. That's really a kind of modern idea that the Greeks didn't have. And certainly the ancient Spartans would have had no problem with Kratos' general worldview on things. But of course, the whole series ends with a world without gods. And all along the game questions the nature and the role of the gods. Euripides, the ancient Greek playwright, was famous for his questioning of religions and asking if the gods actually existed and were we but pawns in their overall sort of scheme. I can't find any proof, looking at sort of online interviews and that kind of thing, of the game developers taking any direct influence from these ancient playwrights, but I think you can certainly see a general pattern of narrative storytelling from the game itself. And I think this sort of sense of narrative and storytelling and going sort of just beyond inhabiting a world with Greek gods and sort of cities and that side of thing can bring us ultimately to our second and final, since I went first and third, category, which is those games that are very clearly then not just based in a narrative sensation, but are actually fully in a relationship with the actual classical past. Now I'm going to look at two games within the same series for this particular category, and I'm going to do this via probably the most famous game right now in the field, the video game in the field of classical studies, and that's Assassin's Creed. Now, much like God of War, Assassin's Creed is a well-established franchise with many related games, sequels, and prequels under its belt. Unlike God of War, Assassin's Creed games have always tried to have a strong historical component to them, and often tout their games as being, quote, historically accurate, within the framework, at least, of a fictionalized game. Now, the game itself, of course, is an action-oriented RPG. The first one came out in 2007. Developed by French and Canadian company Ubisoft, the first Assassin's Creed met with similar critical and commercial acclaim as God of War. Now, the game's conceit, I imagine most of you played this, but anyway, the game's conceit is that there's an eternal war between the assassins, the good guys, and the Knights Templar, the bad guys. But the overarching backstory is pretty convoluted that has to do with aliens, evil corporations, and genetic memory. I'm going to ignore all of that. I am just going to concentrate on essentially the kind of historicity of the games. Now, as you can see, everything from the Third Crusade to Victorian England has been covered as times and places where this struggle takes place. Certainly these games are hugely popular and have sold over 100 million copies, and one reason is the stunning, often painstakingly realistic graphics. Just to give you an idea, here are some sort of famous monuments that have cropped up in these games. You have the Dome of the Rock from the original Assassin's Creed game, Hagia Sophia from Assassin's Creed Revelations, and Notre Dame Cathedral from Assassin's Creed Unity. And of course, as anybody who has played these games know, these are not merely buildings in a distance to look at, but are fully explorable and climbable structures inside and out. But for our purposes, there are two games in the series that are germane to what I'm talking about, and I'm going to take them chronologically as they appeared. The first is 2017's Assassin's Creed Origins. Now, after taking a few years off from the franchise, Ubisoft decided to stop telling the overall story chronologically and went back in time to explore the roots of this conflict between the Assassins and the Templars. The fact that the game developers decided to use ancient Egypt as the setting for this, with its rich history and numerous alien conspiracy theories, should be of little surprise. What might be, however, is that the game is not set in Old or Middle Kingdom Egypt, but rather is set within the Ptolemaic Age. Now, in this particular game, you play as Bayek, a native Egyptian and a member of the Magi. Now, this group of elite warriors is perhaps best known from the Brendan Fraser mummy movies, but it was an actual historical organization. It's kind of like a police force that was around between the 18th and 20th dynasties of ancient Egypt. This particular game, however, is set between the years 49 and 47 BC, and as Bayek, you work for the people of Egypt during the dynastic struggles between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII. So at times you work with and at times against the Ptolemaic house. Now there's a lot of historical material in this game, places, events, battles, and people that we have in the historical record. I'm going to concentrate on the visual side of things just to give you a taste, but you could go through and unpack historical and literary sources and tropes as well. There is, for example, a lot of interaction between Caesar and Cleopatra in the game. Dialogue and interactions are naturally fictional, as you can see a number of historical sources at use in the depictions of Caesar and Cleopatra. She is shown to be a smart and effective political leader who cares about her people, but she is still portrayed as sexy, sexual, and luxurious. Scholars such as Mary Beard, Joyce Tildesley, and our own Dean of Arts, Sheila Ager, have noted how this portrayal uses and perpetuates Roman sources on Cleopatra and their bias against this foreign queen. Still, while one can argue about the use of pro-Roman sources in the game, the depiction is predicated upon actual historical sources, and Ubisoft did a pretty good job in its historical research.
Egypt is divided. Vast armies amass, while great leaders conspire. Told me, the boy king, he wants the entire region kept under heel.
If you ally with my sister, I will kill every last Roman in Alexandria.
But he is a puppet. We do not know who pulls the strings. The exiled queen Cleopatra thirsts for power.
We have informants in each region.
Across Egypt, mysterious forces work against us.
She wields followers with lethal skill in pursuit of her throne.
It is time for assassinations.
Caesar, the legendary tactician, with the might of Rome at his back. His true motives are unclear.
Together we can do more than Alexander did.
He will have his say before this war is over. Good, evil, these are phantasms of the desert. Willpower is all that matters. You may not be a king, but history follows you.
Assassin's Creed Origins. Available October 27th. Watch more now.
So go buy it. But in addition to these kind of historical aspects and look at characters, Ubisoft did a pretty good job as well at looking at environments and locations. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, for example, has the lighthouse, the library, the tomb of Alexander the Great, the Serapeion, the great temple to Serapis. These and many more locations have been painstakingly restored and can be visited and interactive. So how did Ubisoft go about this research? Well, the company began by sending a team of designers, writers, and producers to sites like Alexandria or Athens to get an overall feel for the art, architecture, and sense of what a Hellenistic Greco-Egyptian city would look like. Again, since it was mentioned in the introduction, Hellenistic is basically from the time when Alexander the Great dies and before Rome becomes sort of the masters of the Mediterranean. And so it's a very dynamic period. But wanting to go even further than just sending their producers and technicians, the team actually hired Dr. Evelyne Ferron, a lecturer at the Université de Sherbrooke, as an archaeologist, and she's a specialist in Egyptology. Now, as you can see from the quote here from her, for 2 years she gave a series of lectures and presentations on source materials to the Ubisoft team, but not just for issues of history and architecture, but things like climate, flora, fauna, food, clothing, entertainment. All of this creates a world in which you feel like you are fully immersed in an actual ancient Greek Egyptian city, to the point where, this drove me nuts the first time I started playing this game, you walk through ancient Alexandria and just the background people talking, they actually speak a mixture of ancient and modern Greek, and sort of as my brain is trying to set both of them apart, it kind of drove me nuts for a little while. But anyway, the creators of the game were understandably proud of all of these achievements, more so because they found that many professionals were interested in using this world and the worlds that they had created as a teaching tool. Teachers thought, well, I can't get a grant anywhere near a Ubisoft budget to create my own kind of stuff, And again, there's no solid numbers for this because, of course, it's all corporate secrets. But any major AAA title like this is usually these days got a budget of between $100 and $500 million. That's money that I don't think Shirk or NSERC is getting ready to give to all of us. But anyway, people were wondering, well, can I use these games as a teaching aid? I can attempt to gamify the classroom. So Ubisoft took these comments to heart and developed a game mode called Discovery Tour, where you can turn off the game elements and just have your character wander around and learn about buildings, people, and events without a bunch of pesky NPCs running up to you for stupid fetch quests. Have a look.
In Assassin's Creed, traditionally, there is, yes, an action component, which is very important, but there is also a very contemplative aspect.
In the Discovery Tour, we really wanted to focus the main experience on discovering and learning.
And all of a sudden, you're not in the game anymore. You're just in Egypt, enjoying it, and looking at the world like never before.
Started up in 2014. A lot of professors were contacting us saying, hey, you know what, it would be amazing if you could do a dedicated mode for us so that we could use that into classrooms. It's been in our mind ever since. We were thinking like, all right, how can we make the game different? Something that would be interesting for students, but also that would be interesting for our players.
The idea is to be able to share the entire world without heavy narrative or fight control that would be a barrier. And we just let you enjoy the entire world, but keeping the interactivity of the game, which is, I think, very important for such a tool. So, in addition to explore the entire world, we decided to add more than 75 tours that are thematically framed. Most of the tours will be about the architecture, the people, the way of life. But we have also very specific stations that are clearly identified, where we will try to tell more about our development process so that people understand a bit better the development of video games.
With the Discovery Tour, we can be proactive about the information that we give, understanding that sometimes it's just artistic liberty, where we raised a little bit the pyramids so that you see them from afar. But the dimensions of the pyramid are actually true, and the way that we build it is actually based on all the knowledge that we have at the moment. Very early on, we knew that something that was interesting was to have external point of view on what we were doing. So to have a scientist and his team doing an external research on our product is great.
On est celui qui décide ce qu'on fait, on pense, donc on est impliqué dans l'action, on est engagé, en plus de l'être parce que c'est intéressant et beau, on est engagé parce qu'on doit prendre des décisions. Et si on regarde tous les détails, si on a quelqu'un qui nous guide pour les voir en plus, on maximise l'apprentissage. Ça veut dire qu'un élève laissé à lui-même, à la maison, en faisant le tour d'idées, apprendrait beaucoup de choses, sans même se faire dire, tu dois apprendre ceci, là.
Reconstructed a world that doesn't exist anymore. Because when we teach, we try to help them to be immersed in that kind of environment, but to see it at the same time. That's something brand new for the teachers and really helpful, because students, I think, will remember more what we teach if they can feel it.
All right, so what do you think? Would that be helpful as students to use this kind of visual to feel things, as Dr. Ferrand said? Well, a test was actually done to find out. Two groups were taught the same material, one via standard lecturing and the other via the game, and then they were given identical tests and asked to recall certain details. The average score on these retention tests was 54% for people taught via lecturing and 44% for the people who used the gaming, which sort of makes me wonder how effective this sort of commercial games are as a teaching tool. What happens, for example, when a company sacrifices historical reality for better gameplay or visuals? As a gamer, this makes me happy. I want this to be an enjoyable experience. But as a teacher, it can frustrate me when there is something obviously incorrect and I know someone somewhere is taking this in as fact. Just what are the intersections of history, gameplay, education, and fun? Does a for-profit company like Ubisoft have a responsibility when it comes to producing historically accurate games beyond sales? Is this the next logical step in for-profit education? How do you correct anything that a student may think is how things really were when they're just at home on their couch eating Cheetos and killing Roman soldiers? Again, I'm not saying this game is full of faults. It is in fact wonderful with lots of historical accuracy behind it. But the need to have a good, cost-effective game may be mutually exclusive from something that is pedagogically sound. I want to show you a few visual examples. As you walk around Egypt, you may stop at stalls selling canopic jars, ushabti figurines, ankhs, and all kinds of other accurately portrayed goods. You can walk into temples and see famous pieces of art from the classical period, such as this Apollo playing a lyre. You can walk into people's homes and see fairly standard Roman wall painting of types that we have numerous examples from sites like Pompeii and elsewhere. You can even just walk around and marvel at the historically accurate landscapes. This is among my favorite screenshots in the entire game, which shows you how weird I am. This is just in the game, this is just outside the city of Cyrene in Egypt, and these are vast fields of silphium. Silphium is a now extinct plant that seems to have been related, it's in the alum family, so related to leeks, garlic, onions, that kind of thing. But it was so prized and used so much that the Romans actually farmed it out of existence. But in Cyrene, they were famous for their silphium. That you can see variants, there's sort of a version that still survives today. Coins of Cyrene had the plants as sort of emblems of the city and everything else. So this is the kind of painstaking research that the people who developed the game did, where you just want to wander around the fields outside of Cyrene as if you are Russell Crowe in Gladiator, just sort of feeling the fields of silphium as you walk by. But yet, you also wander around Alexandria and see things that are kind of off. Here, for example, is clearly a copy of the Panathenaic frieze from the Parthenon in Athens. Well, okay, you can suggest that that was such an important and seminal building that lots of copies might have existed in the later Roman period, but okay, a little odd. Odder still is this vase that shows up everywhere throughout the game. Now, I understand you can't model every individual vase, and so repetition is to be expected, but this particular vase is one that we have in the record. It's in the British Museum, and it actually dates to 520 BC. So how did an amphora from just outside of Athens manage to last almost 500 years and show up in a city like Alexandria in Egypt? My favorite is you walk up to this rather unassuming table in one of your quests. You have to actually read the letter as part of it. And then you've got this weird little thing hanging out here. Again, we have this in the material record. The ancient Athenians had this practice where if a politician was getting too big for their britches, they would ostracize them. Basically, you have a vote, and the city decides, A, is a politician getting out of hand, yes or no? If yes, okay, do we want to exile them and for how long? This is a famous one of these voting pieces that relates to trying to kick out this guy Cimon, son of Miltiades. This dates very specifically to 461 BC, and it is a famous Athenian general, and it is just hanging out on the table in the middle of nowhere in Egypt. Obviously, this is done as a cool little Easter egg, and when I saw this in the game, I totally fanboyed out. But you still need to wonder what was in the designers' minds when they were doing this kind of thing. The same can be said of the game's prequel that surprisingly, and I'll end this off in just a second, but the prequel that sort of came out surprisingly the following year, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, no one was really expecting this game to come out so soon, much less how much of a wave this is going to cause in the field of classics. The game is set during the Peloponnesian War, so the war between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century BC, and you play as a Greek mercenary, and so you can fight for or against either side. You have, as you see, a whole host, I won't go through them, of famous people and places that show up in the game, and by far this game takes classically situated premises to a whole nother level. With the success of Origins, Ubisoft hired a permanent in-house historian, Stéphanie Anne Ruata, a Roman history specialist with a PhD in classics from the Université de Nantes. This game blew up, and suddenly every blog, every public classicist, every gaming site was talking about this game, its historical depth, its relationship to the ancient Greek hero Thucydides, and all of that kind of thing. And the depth of the work and historical accuracy was massive. And like Origins, a lot of this was geared towards learning possibilities through the discovery mode. I have a video, we'll skip over it, it's kind of redundant. But the same issues of historical accuracy, repeated forms, and questionable choices persist. In terms of historical accuracy, while there is much to be admired in the actual reconstructions of various sites that date all the way back to 1200 BC, like this lion gate at the city of Mycenae, you travel to Mycenaean citadels all over Greece in the game, and everything is actually decorated in art from an entirely different culture from the Mycenaean one. You get several quests that involve mysterious writing from the time of these Mycenaeans that you have to solve, but this has nothing to do with actual writing that we have from the people and the time places from this. There's also some interesting questions about the guy who actually gives you these quests, because he seems like a proto-archaeologist in the game. And so for people like me, it's an interesting meta moment. Athens is beautifully rendered within the game and fully explorable, but several buildings here didn't actually exist. And more egregiously, for someone like myself who studies ancient art and is passionate about these things, the statue of Athena right here in the middle of the Acropolis, there's the Parthenon, right here is actually the wrong statue. That's not the right one that should be there. In terms of repeated forms, here is an inscription that shows up over and over and over. You'd think it was the only inscription that the Greeks ever wrote, but it's odd because, again, this is an actual inscription that we have. It is from a healing sanctuary in Greece, and it is about a boy whose eyes were healed by being licked from a dog. Questionable choices abound. So why did they choose this one? I don't know. Pausanias, an ancient Greek writer, describes this particular building in his famous sort of tour guide of Greece, and this is all kind of wrong. You go to the island of Delos, here presented in a very kind of lush and verdant landscape, when those of us who have actually been to this island know that it's a little bit more barren and bleak, and it was famous even in antiquity for its lack of water and rocky landscape. Now, the game has more going for it than against it, and it's just a wonderful experience to walk around and see the world of classical Greece recreated. Everything from details like the actual polychromy that you find on statues. Most people think of ancient Greek and Roman statues as just white marble, but they were all painted in antiquity. It was one of the first things to actually show a bunch of that color, which is great. You see lots of famous people that show up in these things: Pericles, Herodotus, Socrates, right? The details of everyday life are absolutely wonderful. And so we have depictions of women actually weaving as they would have in antiquity. And while all of this is to be lauded, enjoyed, and maybe even used in a classroom setting, it does present the difficulty of representing classics in video games. As games become ever more real and immersive, what role does accuracy play in light of overall enjoyment and storytelling? Does it matter if this particular statue, this giant bronze statue, which was discovered in Rome, in the game sits in Olympia 3 times its actual size and likely 300 years before it was actually created? Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide whether you think these are important issues or not. You can pick up your controller, enter the worlds of ancient Greece and Rome, and see how much of the real classical world is reflected in all of these games. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy if there are any questions. Yes?
Amazing stuff. I really like the lecture. I'm then at one of the prospects, but definitely not in this area. But what I wonder is if you've looked at some of the representations, how they're done in other media versus video games, and what changes by the interactivity, right? Because if you think about like Troy, for example, that
right.
movie where they completely
Correct.
watched some
Everything.
Yeah.
Not some, everything.
So, and that's something that goes into popular
Yes.
culture and again has an impact on people. Like if a kid sees it,
Absolutely, and
in
this,
history class, right?
and to me, this is one of the key issues, and the one, at least at the moment, that I'm most interested in, is this notion of historical accuracy, and where does that fall within an entertainment spectrum? I have no problem with, well, let me rephrase that. I have lots of problem with Troy as a movie, but I have no problem because it's presenting itself as a movie. They've made choices. They say it's our version of this story. I can sit here as a pesky professor and go, that's right, that's wrong, that's right, that's wrong. Yeah, I'm smart. And that kind of thing. My biggest issue is for games like this that specifically say we have an educational function. That's when I think you start to play with dangerous areas. Like I said, I fully understand you can't model everything. You're going to make choices where gameplay is paramount. You are a gamer. It is a game. It's what you're doing. Obviously, a lot of decisions get made at the last minute within the development cycle of games to sort of populate things and design things and change things. I get all that from the reality of it. But then once you start telling people, oh, it is educational, it can be used in a classroom, you can use the discovery mode and everything else. And when you go through the discovery mode, again, you find information that either is incorrect or presents itself as correct, but it is just one opinion among scholars. And so there are multiple things. And so that's where I think this intersection of sort of history or not is important. Yes, they screw it up in movies. Yes, they screw it up in TV shows. Yes, they play around with it in video games and all kinds of other media. But if Troy presented itself as a means of learning about either the historical nature of the ancient Greeks and Trojans, or as a representation of the actual poem of Homer that it was based on, then I would have a lot more problems with it. Yes.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for this. I
Hey.
missed the first part. I will corner you sometime and give you a work on
All right, the second half was the fun part anyway.
or some ancient Greek that came over. And it's still in one of those, wrongly dated so, the other question is, what are you actually trying to teach?
Mm-hmm.
And what experience are you actually trying to have a player
Mm-hmm.
have? So, if I could make an argument that the purpose is exactly to have the player say, wait a minute, is this right? And you as an instructor send them off and say, find out if this is actually an accurate representation. Now, if I actually believe that's the way they put it together, I feel better.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe it for a second, but it's a way of taking it apart. Because the one thing we haven't actually done, you cited those stats where 55%
Yeah.
better of traditional media.
And again, I just found that online as a survey, and I thought it was interesting.
But part of
Take that for what it's worth.
We haven't actually taught people how to learn from games.
Correct.
We taught them how to learn from books,
Mm-hmm.
somewhat from films, certainly from documentaries, but not from games.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all part of it. Anyway, those are two.
No, and I agree with you fully on both of those points. And I think one of the distinctions as well, if we're talking about both teaching students how to learn from video games and then the role of the professor as the mediator among these sort of various groups, is how we view that from a post-secondary situation versus a secondary situation. Certainly my field of classical studies, students these days do not know what it is. Their first encounter with it is at university, whereas 50, 60 years ago, most people in Canada might have taken a year of Latin or something in high school, this sort of thing. And I think very much of the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra movie, where at the beginning of the movie, they actually have a series of quotations from ancient historians that lead up to the beginning scenes. The understanding there is that you, as a casual viewer, might have heard who these authors were, or maybe were taught them in school, and that doesn't happen anymore. And so what do you do if a 14-year-old picks up this game and plays and does not have that mediating character there when it comes to discussing these material and thinking about it, and then has 4 years of their perception, them playing the game, what they have learned from it in their own experience, to then show up and have a professor at university say, well, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong. I mean, partially I feel like a jerk because I'm like shattering certain things that may have been beloved to them. Said I, as a gamer, I kind of don't care about some of this stuff because I just want to have fun while I'm playing it. But I think part of the issue is that gap in terms of history and the way in which history is being taught in a secondary school level as opposed to a post-secondary school. And often a number of the people picking these stuff up are secondary school kids. Yes?